This is emo. No woman will ever satisfy me. I know that now, and I would never try to deny it. But this is actually okay, because I will never satisfy a woman either. Should I be writing such thoughts? Perhaps not. Perhaps it's a bad idea. I can definitely foresee a scenario where that first paragraph could come back to haunt me, especially if I somehow became marginally famous. If I become marginally famous, I will undoubtedly be interviewed by someone in the media, maybe Charlie Rose, and the interviewer will inevitably ask, 15 years ago you wrote that no woman could ever satisfy you. Now that you've been married for almost 5 years, are those words still true? And I will have to say, oh God no, those were the words of an entirely different person, a person whom I can't even relate to anymore. Honestly, I can't imagine an existence without whoever my wife is. She satisfies me in a way that I never even considered. She saved my life, really. Now, I will be lying. I won't really feel that way. But I'll certainly say those words, and I'll deliver them with the utmost sincerity, even though those sentiments will not be true. So then the interviewer will undoubtedly quote lines from this particular paragraph, thereby reminding me that I swore I would publicly deny my true feelings. And I'll chuckle and say, come on, Mr. Rose, that was a literary device. You know I never really believed that. But here's the thing. I do believe that. It's the truth now, and it will be in the future. And while I'm not exactly happy about that truth, it doesn't make me sad either. I know it's not my fault. It's no one's fault, really. Or maybe it's everyone's fault. It should be everyone's fault, because it's everyone's problem. Well, okay, not everyone, not boring people, and not the profoundly retarded. But whenever I meet a dynamic, non-retarded American, I notice that he seems to share a single unifying characteristic: the inability to experience the kind of mind-blowing, transcendent romantic relationship he or she perceives to be a normal part of living. And someone needs to take the fall for this. So instead of blaming no one for this, which is kind of cowardly, or instead of blaming everyone for this, which is kind of meaningless, I'm going to blame John Cusack. I once loved a girl who almost loved me, but not as much as she loved John Cusack. Under certain circumstances, this would have been fine. Cusack is relatively good-looking, he seems like a pretty cool guy, he likes The Clash and The Who at least, and he undoubtedly has millions of bones in the bank. If Cusack and I were competing for the same woman, I could easily accept losing. However, I don't really feel like John and I were competing for the girl I'm referring to, inasmuch as her relationship to Cusack was confined to watching him as a two-dimensional projection pretending to be characters who don't actually exist. Now, there was a time when I would have thought that detachment would have given me a huge advantage over Johnny C, inasmuch as my relationship with this woman included things like talking on the phone and nuzzling under umbrellas and eating pancakes. However, I have come to realize that I perceived this competition completely backwards. It was definitely an unfair battle, but not in my favor. It was unfair in Cusack's favor. I never had a chance. It appears that countless women born between the years of 1965 and 1978 are in love with John Cusack. I cannot fathom how he isn't the #1 box office star in America, because every straight girl I know would sell her soul to share a milkshake with that motherfucker. For upwardly mobile women in their 20s and 30s, John Cusack is the neo-Elvis. But here's what none of these upwardly mobile women seem to realize. They don't love John Cusack. They love Lloyd Dobler. When they see Mr. Cusack, they are still seeing the optimistic, charmingly loquacious teenager he played in Say Anything, a movie that came out more than a decade ago. That's the guy they think he is, when Cusack plays Eddie Thomas in America's Sweethearts, or the sensitive hitman in Grosse Pointe Blank. All his female fans knew he was only acting, but they assumed when the camera stopped rolling, he went back to his genuine self, which was someone like Lloyd Dobler, which was, in fact, someone who is Lloyd Dobler, and someone who continues to have a storybook relationship with Diane Court, or with Ione Skye, depending on how you look at it. And these upwardly mobile women are not alone. We all convince ourselves of things like this. Not necessarily about Say Anything, but about any fictionalized portrayals of romance that happen to hit us in the right place at the right time. This is why I will never be completely satisfied by a woman, and this is why the kind of woman I tend to find attractive will never be satisfied by me. We will both measure our relationship against the prospect of fake love. Fake love is a very powerful thing. That girl who adored John Cusack once had the opportunity to spend a weekend with me in New York at the Waldorf Astoria, but she elected to fly to Portland instead to see the first U.S. appearance by Coldplay, a British pop group whose success derives from their ability to write melodramatic alt-rock songs about fake love. It does not matter that Coldplay is absolutely the shittiest fucking band I've ever heard in my entire fucking life, or that they sound like a mediocre photocopy of Travis, who sound like a mediocre photocopy of Radiohead, or that their greatest fucking artistic achievement is a video where their blandly attractive frontman walks on a beach on a cloudy fucking afternoon. None of that matters. What matters is that Coldplay manufactures fake love as frenetically as the Ford fucking Motor Company manufactures Mustangs. And that's all this woman heard. For you, I bleed myself dry, sang their blockhead vocalist, brilliantly informing us that stars in the sky are, in fact, yellow. How am I going to compete with that shit? That sleepy-eyed bozo isn't even making sense. He's just pouring fabricated emotions over 4 gloomy guitar chords, and it ends up sounding like love. And what does that mean? It means she flies to fucking Portland to hear 2 hours of amateurish UK hyperslop, and I sleep alone in a $270 hotel in Manhattan. And I hope Coldplay gets fucking dropped by fucking EMI and ends up like the Stone fucking Roses, who are actually a better fucking band, all things considered. Not that I'm bitter about this. Oh, I concede that I may be taking this particular example somewhat personally, but I do think it's a perfect illustration of why almost everyone I know is either overtly or covertly unhappy. Coldplay songs deliver an amorphous, irrefutable interpretation of how being in love is supposed to feel, and people find themselves wanting that feeling for real. They want men to adore them like Lloyd Dobler would, and they want women to think like Amy Mann, and they expect all their arguments to sound like Sam Malone and Diane Chambers. They think everything will work out perfectly in the end, just like it did for Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones and Nick Hornby's Rob Fleming. And they don't stop believing, because Journey's Steve Perry insists we should never do that. In the 19th century, teenagers merely aspired to have a marriage that would be better than most of their parents. Personally, I would never be satisfied unless my marriage was as good as Cliff and Claire Huxtable's, or at least as enigmatic as Jack and Meg White's. Pundits are always blaming TV for making people stupid, movies for desensitizing the world to violence, and rock music for making kids take drugs and kill themselves. These things should be the least of our worries. The main problem with mass media is that it makes it impossible to fall in love with any acumen of normalcy. There is no normal, because everyone is being twisted by the same sources simultaneously. You can't compare your relationship with the playful couple who lives next door, because they're probably modeling themselves after Chandler Bing and Monica Geller. Real people are actively trying to live like fake people, so real people are no less fake. Every comparison becomes impractical. This is why the impractical has become totally acceptable. Impracticality almost seems cool. The best relationship I ever had was with a journalist who was as crazy as me, and some of our coworkers like to compare us to Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen. At the time, I used to think, yeah, that's completely valid. We fight all the time, our love is self-destructive, and if she was mysteriously killed, I'm sure I would be wrongly arrested for second-degree murder before dying from an overdose. We even watched Sid and Nancy in her parents' basement and giggled the whole time. That's us, we said gleefully. And like I said, this was the best relationship I ever had. And I suspect it was the best one she ever had, too. Of course, this media transference is not all bad. It has certainly worked to my advantage, just as it has for all modern men who look and talk and act like me. We all owe our lives to Woody Allen. If Woody Allen had never been born, I'm sure I would be doomed to a life of celibacy. Remember the aforementioned woman who loved Cusack and Coldplay? There was absolutely no way I could have dated this person if Woody Allen didn't exist. In tangible terms, she was light years out of my league, along with most of the other women I've slept with. But Woody Allen changed everything. Woody Allen made it acceptable for beautiful women to sleep with nerdy, bespectacled goofballs. All we need to do is fabricate the illusion of intellectual humor, and we somehow have a chance. The irony is that many of the women most susceptible to this scam haven't even seen any of Woody's movies, nor would they want to touch the actual Woody Allen if they ever had the chance, especially since he's proven to be an uber-pervy clarinet freak. If asked, most of these foxy ladies wouldn't classify Woody Allen as sexy, or handsome, or even likable. But this is how media devolution works. It creates an archetype that eventually dwarfs its origin. By now, the Woody Allen personality type has far greater cultural importance than the man himself. Now, the argument could be made that all of this is good for the sexual bloodstream of Americana, and that all these women who want Woody are being unconsciously conditioned to be less shallow than their sociobiology dictates. Self-deprecating cleverness has become a virtue. At least on the surface, movies and television actively promote dating the non-beautiful. If we have learned anything from the mass media, it's that the only people who can make us happy are those who don't strike us as being particularly desirable. Whether it's Jerry Maguire or 16 Candles or Who's the Boss or Some Kind of Wonderful or Speed Racer, we are constantly reminded that the unattainable icons of perfection we lust after can never fulfill us like the platonic allies who have been there all along. The notable exceptions to this being Vertigo, where the soft-hearted Barbara Bel Geddes gets jammed by sexpot Kim Novak, and My So-Called Life, where poor little Brian Krakow never got any play even though Jordan Catalano couldn't fucking read. If we all took media messages at their absolute face value, we'd all be sleeping with our best friends. Now that does happen, sometimes, usually in college. But herein lies the trap. We've also been trained to think that this will always work out over the long term, which dooms us to disappointment. Because when push comes to shove, we really don't want to have sex with our friends, unless they're sexy. And sometimes we do want to have sex with our black-hearted, soul-sucking enemies, assuming they're sexy. Because that's all it ever comes down to in real life, regardless of what happened to Michael J. Fox and Teen Wolf. The mass media causes sexual misdirection. It prompts us to need something deeper than what we want. This is why Woody Allen has made nebbish guys cool. He makes people assume there is something profound about having a relationship based on witty conversation and intellectual discourse. There isn't. It's just another gimmick, and it's no different than wanting to be with someone because they're thin or rich, or the former lead singer of Whiskeytown. And it actually might be worse, because an intellectual relationship isn't real at all. My witty banter and cerebral discourse is always completely contrived. Right now, I have 3.5 days worth of material, all of which I pretend to deliver spontaneously. Here's one example I tend to deploy on a second date, just in case you're curious, and it's usually rewarded with an enduring guffaw at least 90% of the time. I ask the woman what religion she is. Inevitably, she will say something like, "Oh, I'm sort of Catholic, but I'm pretty lapsed in my participation." Or like she'll say, "Well, I'm kind of Jewish, but I don't really practice anymore." Virtually everyone under the age of 30 will answer that question in this manner. They will say that they're sort of a religion, but they're sort of not. I then respond by saying, "Yeah, it seems like everybody I meet describes themselves as sort of Catholic, or sort of Jewish, or sort of Methodist. Do you think all religions have this problem? I mean, do you think that there are 25-year-old Amish people who say, 'Well, I'm sort of Amish. I currently work as a computer programmer, but I still believe pants with metal zippers are the work of Satan.'" So, anyways, this is my strategy. If I can just coerce the woman into the last half of that fourth date, it's anyone's ballgame. I've beaten the system. I've broken the code. I've slain the Minotaur. If we part ways on that fourth evening without some kind of conversational disaster, she probably kind of digs me. Or at least she thinks she digs me, because who she digs is not really me. Sadly, our relationship will not last 93 minutes like Annie Hall, or 96 minutes like Manhattan. It will go on for days or weeks or months or years, and I've already used everything in my vault. Very soon, I will have nothing more to say, and we will be sitting across from each other at breakfast, completely devoid of banter. She will feel betrayed and foolish, and I will suddenly find myself actively trying to avoid spending time with a woman I didn't deserve to be with in the first place. Perhaps this sounds depressing. That is not my intention. This is all normal. There's not a lot to say during breakfast. I mean, you just woke up, Nothing has happened. If neither person had an especially weird dream, and nobody burned the toast, breakfast is just the time for chewing Cocoa Puffs and or wishing you were still asleep. But we've been convinced not to think like that. Silence is only supposed to happen as a manifestation of supreme actualization, where both parties are so at peace with their emotional connection that it cannot be expressed through the rudimentary tools of the lexicon. Otherwise, silence is proof that the magic is gone and the relationship is over. Hence the phrase, "we just don't talk anymore." For those of us who grew up in the media age, the only good silence is the kind described by the hair metal band Extreme. "More than words is all I ever needed you to show," explained Gary Sharon on the Porno Graffiti album. "Then you wouldn't have to say you love me, because I'd already know." This is the difference between art and life. In art, not talking is never an extension of having nothing to say. Not talking always means something. And now that art and life have become completely interchangeable, we're all forced to live inside the acoustic power chords of Nuno Bettencourt, even if most of us don't necessarily know who the fuck Nuno Bettencourt is. When Harry Met Sally hit theaters in 1989, I didn't see it until 1997, but it turns out I could have skipped it entirely. The movie itself isn't bad, which is pretty amazing in and of itself since it stars Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal, and there are funny parts and sweet parts and smart dialogue, and all things considered, it's a well-executed example of a certain kind of entertainment. A certain kind meaning bad. Yet watching this film in 1997 was like watching the 1978 one-game playoff between the Yankees and the Red Sox on ESPN Classic. Even though I've never sat through the pitch sequence that leads to Bucky Dent's 3-run homer, I know exactly what happened. I feel like I remember it, even though I don't. And, more importantly, I know what it all means. Knowing about sports means knowing that Bucky Dent is the living, breathing, metaphorical incarnation of the Bo Sox then undying futility. I didn't have to see that game to understand the fabric of its existence. I didn't need to see When Harry Met Sally either. Within 3 years of its initial release, classifying any intense friendship as totally a Harry Met Sally situation had a recognizable meaning to everyone, regardless of whether or not they'd actually seen the movie. And that meaning remains clear and remarkably consistent. It implies that two platonic acquaintances are refusing to admit that they're deeply in love with each other. When Harry Met Sally cemented the plausibility of that particular notion, and it gave a lot of desperate people hope. It made it realistic to suspect your best friend may be your soulmate, and it made wanting such a scenario comfortably conventional. The problem is that the Harry Met Sally situation is almost always tragically unbalanced. Most of the time, the two involved parties are not really best friends. Inevitably, one of the people has been in love with the other from the very first day they met, while the other person is either A, racked with guilt and pressure, or B, completely oblivious to the espoused attraction. Every relationship is fundamentally a power struggle, and the individual in power is whoever likes the other person less. But Harry Met Sally gives the powerless, unrequited lover a reason to live. When this person gets drunk and tells his friends that he's in love with a woman who only sees him as a buddy, they will say, "You're wrong. You're perfect for each other. This is just like When Harry Met Sally. I'm sure she loves you. She just doesn't realize it yet." Nora Ephron accidentally ruined a lot of lives. I remember taking a course in college called Communication and Society, and my professor was obsessed by the belief that fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood were evil. She said they were part of a latent social code that hoped to suppress women and minorities. At the time, I was mildly outraged that my tuition money was supporting this kind of crap. But years later, I have come to recall those pseudo-savvy lectures as what I loved about college. But I still think they were probably wasteful, and here's why. Even if those theories are true, they're barely significant. The Three Little Pigs is not the story that is fucking people up. Stories like Say Anything are fucking people up. We don't need to worry about people unconsciously absorbing archaic secret messages when they're 6 years old. We need to worry about all the entertaining messages people are consciously accepting when they're 26 years old. They're the ones that get us, because they're the ones we try to turn into life. I mean, Christ. I wish I could believe that bozo in Coldplay when he tells me that stars are yellow. I miss that girl. I wish I was Lloyd Dobler. I don't want anybody to step on a piece of broken glass. I want fake love, but that's all that I want, and that's why I can't have it.